Okay, hi everybody. My name is Andrew Shikiar, Executive Director and CEO at FIDO Alliance. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the third of four sessions we have on FIDO's Passkey design guidance. As many of you know, FIDO Alliance has been investing quite heavily in user experience and all things UX over the past couple of years, as usability is really paramount to our efforts to see passkeys replace passwords as the go-to form of user authentication at massive scale. So today's theme is driving revenue and decreasing costs with passkeys for consumer authentication. Let me go through a couple of housekeeping notes, welcoming you to the webinar. For those of you who have done this before, you're familiar with these tips. For those of you who are new, please listen in. All of you are in listen-only mode to start off with, actually throughout the webinar. You can ask questions. There's a widget for you to ask questions, and we'll be handling most of the Q&A at the end of the webinar. If there's anything that we can answer quickly, we'll do that directly to you in the same widget. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be emailed to you afterwards and published after the event. Last but not least, we ask that you stay on to take the survey at the end of the webinar. Your feedback is incredibly valuable, so we'd appreciate you taking an added moment or two to provide that feedback through the survey. As I mentioned, this is the third of four webinars that we're doing on Passkey design. The first two were very well attended, very engaging. They're available to view on demand. So the first one was Passkeys Foundation of Consumer Authentication Strategy. The second one was on aligning authentication experiences with business goals. And then today, of course, or the next one will be on design guidelines, so kind of an AMA. So ask us anything on Passkey design. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our panel of experts led by Mitchell Gallivan. Mitch is with Google. He's also the co-chair of our user experience working group. Mitchell, take it away.
Thank you so much, Andrew. As was mentioned, my name is Mitchell Gallivan. I lead Authentication UXD at Google, and I'm also co-chair of the UX working group with the FIDO Alliance. Today, I'll be sharing this airtime with Philip, who's a senior manager user experience at RSA, and he's also a big part of the UX working group as well. We'll also hear from Matthias, who's a chief scientist and SVP of technology at Kayak. And although today you're hearing from just a few of us, it is the FIDO UX working group and the FIDO Alliance is made up of a lot of really, really important and influential groups that you might have heard of. And in particular, I do want to call out to the FIDO Alliance member underwriters, and that's 1Password, Duo, Dashlane, Google, HID, Trusona, US Bank, and Yubico. And just to sort of bring the thread in from one of our earlier webinars, we shared that passwords alone aren't safe. And just to give the sort of cliff notes on that one, we have found that passwords are difficult to remember, they're difficult to manage. Users often forget passwords and find them hard to deal with. And paper is still the go-to method for storing them, even though we have a lot of really great credential manager companies out there driving amazing UX for these experiences. And passwords are super easy to guess. One thing we found at Google was that we just did a small research. We just did a little bit of research into it, and we found that about 33% of users in the US report having attempted to guess someone else's password, and 73% of those 33% report being successful at least once, which is really interesting. Passwords tend to be reused, and that's a really big problem because of password recycling and password washing. But this is really ultimately a symptom of how difficult it is to create and recall unique passwords every single time you got to deal with one. And we also have some quantitative metrics that suggest that, based on surveys, that customers and IT leaders are effectively ready to move on from passwords. And customers really believe that biometrics and PINs and even SMS codes are more secure than just passwords. And IT leaders really think that passwords are a weak way to secure data. And so that's really sort of some of the broad strokes of what I covered in the first webinar. And I want to talk today about like why passwords and SMS aren't really the solution, and then Matthias and Philip will share more about their stories, which I think will sort of demonstrate that more effectively. And one of the things we're most familiar with authentication is sort of username, password, then SMS code. And we're all really familiar with this. Sort of, you try and sign in, your phone lights up, you got to type in a code, or if you're on your phone, sometimes you could just tap a button and have the SMS code automatically filled in for you. And while this is super familiar, super natural, and a lot of folks have gotten really used to it, like even folks who aren't necessarily tech experts like us are really used to it. Think of like elderly, think of people who just aren't super involved with computers and just use them as a tool. They know this system and they know it really well. And ultimately, what we know at Google and at FIDO is that passkeys really offer better security, usability, and cost effectiveness for both users and companies. And that really plays into the title of the webinar today. And so I have these swim lanes here to sort of like describe in a very clear way some of the pitfalls and how they do or pitfalls of SMS and how they do or don't affect passkeys. So SMS, for example, requires your phone to be nearby, working with active service to get that SMS code. And those are a lot of requirements. That requires like the cell phone network to be up. It requires like everybody's sort of bills to be paid up and on time and available, their phone to be ready to get SMS. And that doesn't really affect passkeys because this all happens sort of digitally on the devices and doesn't really depend on a phone network or anything like that. So that's a really powerful thing to think about, is sort of the availability of those passkeys. And each SMS code sent costs, and these prices vary quite a lot globally. I understand there's packages you can do. I understand that there's subscription services. There's ways to manage this cost, but effectively there's a direct line between the growth of your user base and then the cost of SMS for authentication. So that as you have users signing in, that kind of ends up costing a little bit every time, and that really adds up. And passkeys really don't have that kind of cost per use, which I think is a really interesting thing to take away from them, is that they're offering better usability, more security. It's largely happening on device in most journeys. And that's a really powerful thing to think about. Your cell phone really isn't really a key factor when authenticating. Another important thing to think about is SIM swapping. So SIM swapping is a vulnerability of SMS that just doesn't affect passkeys. And this involves somebody convincing your phone company to transfer your phone number onto a new SIM card that they can use. And this isn't a particularly uncommon or unheard of attack. So this is a very important thing to consider. And this does not affect passkeys at all, because there isn't somebody that can be tricked on the other end of a phone line, a support line, to sort of bringing your phone number over to a new SIM card. And phishing, fake texts are pretending to be from you or your company or somebody you're using for authentication, and getting that customer to provide that authentication code to a phisher or an attacker. This is also this is not an unheard of attack vector as well, and this doesn't affect passkeys either, because these attacks are completely remote. It's often that the customer isn't really involved very much in these, and so there isn't a lot you can do to protect somebody in this case. But again, these don't affect passkeys. And passkeys are a really, really massive leap forward in authentication, but I do want to be super real with everybody and just be clear that they're not a panacea for every single authentication challenge you might encounter. And so if an attacker, for example, gets access to a mobile device, they can affect, just like they can get with passwords, just like they can access your SMS codes if they come in, they could also ostensibly access your passkeys, especially if they know the PIN of the device or the biometric of the device, or they have enrolled their own PIN or biometric on the device. And also server-side attacks could circumvent the security of passkeys as well. And again, this affects all authentication systems. So passkeys solve a tremendous amount of pain points that exist, but not absolutely every single identity technology risk that there is. And also, there's a lot of upfront costs with somebody having their account compromised. And this is, again, a lot more likely with non-passkey authentication systems. They can really cost somebody an arm and a leg. And so there's the fraud cost. And so that's the cost of successful attacks, like loss of access, fraud, and cost of customer support, and everything involved in getting somebody back into their account. There's, of course, time costs of SMS. So it takes a while if you got to take a code from your phone and put it on your laptop, unless they're a pair of devices that are really, really sort of interconnected, you gotta take the time to unlock your phone, get the code, put it in your brain, and then put it into the keyboard so you can sign in. And that's a lot of time spent cumulatively. And there's also, of course, as I touched on earlier, price per text sent. And I kind of have some estimated costs based on some cursory research online, and this can really add up fast. Again, this is like a direct line per SMS sent to the growth of your user base during authentication. So this is like a linear graph of cost going upwards. There's also less direct costs as well. Again, as I mentioned, there is the higher likelihood of compromise if you're not using passkeys, and this can manifest in the form of like a breach of trust. So a non-technical user may not see that their SMS code was stolen or their phone number was stolen or something happened, and they may simply blame your company for the breach, when maybe a lot of things happen with their carrier or with their local device and so on. So that can be really tough to deal with, and passkeys help you avoid a lot of those risks and vectors. There's also reliability of access. Again, I touched on this earlier, but with passkeys, you're not depending on cell phone carriers, cell phone signal, and if the passkey is local and on the device, you're not even depending on the cell phone at all. It doesn't even have to be charged up or available. They just need the laptop or the tablet or another cell phone to be available with the passkey on it. So that's really, really amazing. That's a whole sort of risk in terms of a user's preparation. That's just not the case with passkeys. You don't have to worry about it. And then there's speed of access as well. And we know on the Google side, we've talked about this before, that what really resonates with our user base is convenience, and a subset of what especially resonates with our user base is speed of access. And so making access and authentication sort of really fast, really easy. If it's not that, then users are less likely to engage, users are less likely to sign in, and then you can't always give them the best experience first time around or even returning experiences. And also, passkeys are a really proven success. And so I think there's some really interesting metrics on this slide. And so, for example, TikTok has seen a 97% login success rate with passkeys. They've seen a 14% eligible user adoption rate with passkeys so far, and a 2% reduction in SMS OTP login. And so on TikTok scale, with all different kinds of users signing in, I'm sure that manifests as very appealing savings. Mercari's sign-in success rate grew from 67.7% with SMS to 82.5%. That's a 21% improvement over SMS of just sign-in success at Mercari, which is really great. So that's all the more users signing in. That's more users who are accessing their same profile, who are getting the returning benefits when you ask them to set up a profile in Mercari. That's really great. And they're also finding that users are signing in 4 times faster. That's awesome. Here in New Zealand, 30% opt-in for the first 24 hours, 4.7% improvement time to complete an improvement in success rate. That's also really amazing. Those are incredible metrics. I don't know what else you could do during authentication to sort of achieve those kinds of numbers. 50% reduction in abandonment rates, and reduce the account recovery calls and call center attacks. So that's really great, because your call center can do a lot of great things that aren't just getting somebody back into their account. You can support users, you can help users, you can meet their needs in different ways, and you're not spending time solving this problem that passkeys have effectively already solved. And at Google, we see lots of really interesting improvements in sign-in success rate. We see sometimes, or a lot of the time, like over half the sign-in time. So compared to using a password in a second step, users using passkeys are getting into their account twice as fast, or it's taking half as long, which is really great. And we've also hit some really interesting milestones recently. We know that passkeys have been used to authenticate people over 1 billion times, which is really cool. And they have been used across over 400 million Google accounts, which is awesome. We're super excited about that. And now I'm going to hand off to Matthias.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. Today I'm going to talk about the passkey implementation at Kayak. We have been one of the first relying parties offering passkeys sign up and sign in on our site back in 2022. And let's talk about why we made that step to go into passkeys so quick. I'm now at the company for almost 11 years, and 10 of these years, I've basically been involved in the engineering of our authentication system. And what we have seen over time, talking today about cost, is that the cost to keep the password-based system secure has been going up, driven by complexity. Let me give some examples. At the very beginning, when the company started off 20 years ago, Sure, nobody wanted to have complex things to keep in mind. As we heard before, nobody had a password manager. It was all sticky notes. So we wanted to have something simple: our birth date, the name of our kids, our own name, the email address, just make it very simple to get back in. And so companies like us had to educate the user that it is more secure if they have a longer password. We had to ask them to maybe put in a number. Later, we also wanted a symbol. We started to see forbidden patterns, like 6 times entering the number 1 or having your own username in the password, all these things. And we also got more and more, there was the idea that people do not only use the same password for their own purposes the same way, but many people use the same password, and there used to be an old statistics of the word "I love you" being the most used password in the world. This was really the user education piece, but as much as also accounts became more valuable, we started to do e-commerce, we started to have our personal data in there. There was now also the interest of other parties to get into our accounts. And so the next level we saw is that we now had better passwords and we couldn't get these sticky notes anyways, but there was a time when we heard a lot about password databases being breached. And this is unfortunately still happening today, but companies like ours, again, had to put in the extra effort of mitigation, such as using techniques like hashing and salting, changing the algorithms we use to store the passwords, putting them in more secure places. And just from a user perspective, let me point out that if we talk about changing the hashing and salting, it may mean something like every single user having to set a new password because the old password may not convert over to the new system. This felt still manageable, but in the period where I would say we are now, where we talk about phishing, so people setting up fake sites that look like ours, or where we talk about all these other passwords that have been stolen in other places and that probably have been reused, up to the latest trend where basically cyber criminals install software on our computers, it became extremely difficult to trust passwords. We have to make sure that nobody can try out too many at the same time. We have to really think about, okay, there's a login from this location. Does this fit to that user? Maybe not, maybe it does. We have all kind of risks. We even now have these large databases that we can use where we know millions of accounts that are known to have shown up in certain breaches and that are compromised, and we have to treat them that way. And long story short, it's this extremely complex engine that is not only not perfect, it is also really troublesome for our users because they now have to go through all these CAPTCHAs or maybe receive an email with a code. And now, especially talking about cost, this is not a one-time effort. So state-of-the-art algorithms constantly change. The different techniques of the hackers constantly change. So there's this permanent maintenance that is going on to trying to keep up the dream of keeping passwords secure. And so we decided to opt out of this dream of keeping passwords secure with the help of Passkeys. Our first implementation went live in September 2022, which was the release date of iOS 16 at Picos Ventura. We immediately also later added support to this was covering iOS and all web browsers. And then shortly after, we also added support for our Android application. And in that go around, we also made a really great case study together with our friends at Google, where we also saw that now, since we have Passkeys, that the time to create an account was reduced by 50%, which is a massive benefit of not waiting for an email, not having to work through password creation rules, and just a wonderful experience that helps the business. If you today come to Kayak and create a new account, creating an account using a passkey is your default choice. And you can, of course, if you have an account for us for 10 years, you can now also, of course, add a passkey to your existing account. We know that not everyone supports passkeys yet. It is getting more and more rare that somebody has a client that doesn't support passkeys. And for these users, we offer email-based one-time codes. But I want to particularly point out here that we actually deleted all our passwords in December 2023, giving up on the idea of keeping passwords secure. Certainly, implementing passkeys is a certain investment. I would say it totally pays back, and it is rather low compared to everything else we had to do in the password space. Getting into passkeys, and you will hear about the resources later, is incredibly simple. It can also be done in very nice incremental ways. Basically, it entails, of course, to allow users to create accounts with passkeys, to sign in with their account using a passkey. Later on, it is also preferred to have ways to manage these passkeys, like for instance, to see what passkeys I have. Maybe I want to delete a passkey. And then in the last step is the question, what is the migration strategy? Like in our case, it was getting rid of passwords altogether. There's a little bit of, certainly no system runs by itself, but there's a little minimal cost of having this system. Right now, we are one of the earliest sites, or we were one of the earliest sites to support passkeys. So we had maybe a bit more questions of people who saw passkeys for the first time. We were very happy to give this piece of tech support. And for the time being, we also have to still have an alternative, at least one alternative sign-in options, which is signing with Google, or here the other example, the one-time code on the email. The savings are tremendous and overshadowing all the investment here. Before, when we were in the password world, we had a big effort for our security team who had to constantly monitor and defend all these malicious actors that showed up with another password dump, so to speak, and tried millions of accounts. This has all happened in real time. So it's permanently watching that authentication system. And we also have significantly lower efforts now into permanently having to step up the game that we had to do in the password world when the tactics of the attackers kept changing week by week. And finally, as we've seen of the statistics that Mitchell shared, and also that our statistics point to, fewer people now drop off. And since we are an e-commerce site, dropping off usually means like they're actually trying to book a flight or to book a hotel, and we don't want users to drop off in that stage. It has been a tremendous success for Kayak, and for the webinar, we now continue with Philip.
Thank you, Matthias. So I'm going to dive into a bit of data to sort of build upon what Matthias and Mitchell have already talked about. You know, the cost savings is real, not just in the deprecation of SMS OTP, but also in IT support calls and making it smoother for your users to get onboarded and not have an issue of forgetting their passwords or having their accounts hacked. So Shauna Pettit-Brown, my researcher here, lead researcher here at RSA, did some research in the last 2 months, and we're still a bit surprised as where we are, right, where we're at today. And if you look at the number of times that people are using passwords still, it's extremely high. And you know, for us, when we think about it, even for FIDO, when they think about it, right, the value proposition is to include a mix of security, convenience, and cost, so that both sides of the equation are benefited, right? Not just the end user, but also the businesses that are implementing passkeys. And so this started to make us think about a lot of different aspects of passkey adoption and cost savings. So we looked at the next thing, which was we started to get evidence around where people are in their journey of passkey implementations. And when I say it's a journey, it's a real journey. Because if you look at the stratification of the different types of companies that are, and businesses that are trying to implement passkeys, it can be everything from someone who only has a website to someone who has multiple hardware assets that are deployed across the world, as well as websites and devices. So, you know, for the difference in cost savings for the implementation, there's two aspects that I really think about, right? One is what is the cost for the implementation versus the benefit to the business and the security, and also when you start looking at SMS OTP costs or other costs, you can mitigate those and eliminate those over time, so you don't have these reoccurring costs that you're getting hit with because you're constantly sending out codes. And so, you know, you have to be very mindful of how you engage on the passkey journey, and you have to sort of understand that there are some people that are innovators ahead of the curve, and there's a bunch of people that are laggards. But the most of us in this industry are right in the middle of the bell curve, right? Early majority, late majority, really trying to think about, okay, what is the benefit for us implementing passkeys? What's the cost in development? Because it's not a switch that you just turn on in deploying passkeys. And then what other cost savings can we get from it from a business perspective? Reduce calls to the help desk, for example. So the other thing is, because this is the UX working group, this is a pretty strong statement that I talked to the panel about before I say it, but UX can be your Achilles heel. Your adoption of anything, whether it's passwords, whether it's SMS OTP, whether it's passkeys, doesn't matter where you are as we move to more secure ways of getting people to authenticate. If you don't have a smooth, frictionless user experience, you are going to run into problems and people will not want to adopt it. And so what we've found is that if you look at the slide in depth, right, educating the user. It's not just educating the business, it's educating the user as to why this is better for them. And if the experience is more user-friendly than what they currently have, so if you think about what Mitchell said, right, you got to get a code, you have to potentially type that code in manually, you have to have your phone connected. Like there's so many friction points that will make people abandon that journey that if it was just passkeys, they just simply go through the process. It's smooth, it's a great user experience. Now, if you look at this from the number of clicks and steps, right, ease of usability drives the adoption rates. And so the faster that you can drive the adoption rate, and think about when onboarding people to passkeys in your journey is appropriate. So it could be inline registration, it could be account creation, it could be password renewal, right, or reset. And so really starting to get them to a point where the number of clicks that they take to do an authentication is down to the minimum is critical. And once you do that, people will start to adopt it, and that's when you'll start to reap the benefits and cost savings associated with moving to passkeys. Now, what's the framework? I talked about the stratification of different companies, right? Everybody has a different job to be done. So for example, in Matthias' example, it is you want to get them into the site, you want to get them logged in, you want them to have them book the hotel or the flight and be done with it and get out, right? So first he had to get the organizational buy-in of Kayak that, hey, we really do need to get away from passwords. We really do need to reduce the attack surface. We really do need to help the end user experience become better. Then you've got to move into implementation. Okay, so what is it going to take from an engineering perspective and an IT readiness in order to get something like this implemented into the product? And how long do you have to have, as I say in Canada, 1 foot in one canoe and 1 foot in another canoe? How long do you have to keep those passwords, right? Versus just moving directly to passkeys, because you can't just do the switch overnight. And then the last thing that we've spent a lot of time talking about is the end user acceptance, right? If your end user is not going to accept it, or if you're going to constantly introduce friction points and barriers to adoption, they're just going to abandon the transaction and they're going to move on. And so these are all things that, you know, we think about, especially as RSA, on the jobs to be done. And protecting the right resources with the right level of authentication is critical. And passkeys will help you reduce that attack surface. So this slide is sort of like a rah-rah slide. It's the better together slide. And because I'm a UX professional, it takes a lot of time and energy to get the business to come along on my journeys all the time, because the answers I get is it's too much work. And my answer is, well, it's going to provide cost savings and our users are going to be much happier. So, you know, I have a mantra that I've said for years and years and years: collaboration, communication, and transparency. It takes all the disciplines within an organization to come together, including marketing, right, to get that messaging, to really understand how we're going to position this to the end user and how we're going to develop something that is critical. And the reason why there's a base plate here of education is because that communication and really having people understand, where is the passkey stored? Is it synced? Is it transferable? Is it device bound? How do I turn it off or turn it on, right? All those types of management. It's a new type of authentication method. Some users don't care. Some users are deeply concerned. And so FIDO research in the past has shown that some people are like, oh, nope, not going to do passkeys. I'm going to stay with my old password. Others are like, hey, yeah, this sounds really cool. I think it's going to be, you know, it's going to benefit me and it's going to make my experiences easier in my transactions. So really educating and prompting end users to go through that journey with you is critical. So now that I've said better together, right? So internally, you're also not alone. I think that one of the emphasis that I really want to make is that the FIDO Alliance working group, UX working group specifically, along with the rest of the other working groups, have built many assets to help you along your journey. And we realized that this is a journey with multiple waypoints. For some people, it may be easy. For others, it may be extremely daunting. And I think that, from talking to Jackie a lot in the FIDO Alliance, it's like, if you need help, get help, engage others, leverage all of the assets that have been built by FIDO to help you implement Passkeys. But more importantly, do that analysis, right? Do the analysis of why you want to do this, what's the jobs you're trying to accomplish, and how much money can you actually save by going this way? And also, remember, security first. So you're reducing that threat landscape. You're really helping your users to be more protected. So that's what I have to say to support Mitchell and Matthias's sort of data around cost savings for a business implementation. Now I want to take a few seconds and go through the FIDO design guidelines, which have been presented multiple times, I think, across a lot of the webinars. But it's important that we actually go through this material just so you know. How does FIDO produce design guidelines? Well, when you think about the amount of effort that it goes in and the amount of collateral that we have to build, it's a big space for us to work in. We curated 270 passkey touch points that were documented. Well, we can't do all of that work. So we grouped them into 7 themes and identified those themes as the important ones. Then we moved on to, okay, what design patterns do we really need to build to get the table stakes, the basic building blocks for people to start implementing passkeys? And so we did 6 design patterns that we pursued in 2024. We audited 8 well-known passkey deployments so that we had some base knowledge going into our design requirements. Then we built prototypes and ideated experiences, but more importantly, we tested them. Now, to be clear, in this particular workflow, the UX working group was focused on the consumer use cases, unregulated. I'm from RSA, so I represent both consumer as well as enterprise, which have their own pitfalls. But they also covered iOS, Android, Windows, and 8 service providers. So they didn't just do this once. It was an iterative process, rinse and repeat, refine and redevelop. And so they did that 6 times, then leading to publishing 14 total patterns that will help you drive business outcomes, which is a huge body of work. So I encourage everyone to go and take a look. What's included? What do you get? Well, from all of the work that we did in 2024, which is the 4th year that they're publishing guidelines, you actually get access to the raw user experience research. So you understand what research was conducted and that these weren't just fabricated out of the minds of the people that are actually in the working group. What else do you get? You get the 10 UX principles, right? And 3 content principles for how passkeys can be developed and shared. And then you get design patterns. This is where you start. This is the building blocks of the race, right? This is your starting gate. You actually are provided with assets that will get you from the bottom to start working on your implementations and understanding where you need to go. Then there's some optional design patterns that have been developed. And then finally, there's an entire set of resources that are going to be available to you. And it's really critical that you take the time to go and get those assets, because we have some real prime low-hanging opportunities that we're trying to go after, right? Number 1, password first attacks are growing. Protect you and your users. Reduce the threat landscape. Second, reduce phishing, credential stuffing, and available attack surfaces. 3, reduce costs like SMS and IT support for password resets and or failures, and or, heaven forbid, if you get breached, right? So it's really understanding how to reduce the costs overall based on the fact that you're going to move to an implementation with passkeys. For consumer applications specifically, reduce abandonment, right? It's horrible when you develop an amazing product and all of a sudden people are jettisoning out of your funnel before they even make the purchase, right? You're making the friction too high. You have to lower the friction to make sure that you can get them through to help them accomplish what their end goal is, which is a potential purchase, I guess, in Kayak's particular case, right? If you make the user experience easy for your product or your website, your company, you will increase customer loyalty and retention because they'll start to believe in you. You'll become a trusted partner because you care about their security. You care about protecting their transactions, and you care about the experience they have when they come to your product. So that's extremely important. And then finally, increase ease of use, accessibility, and faster sign-in. Everybody loves faster sign-in. Reduce the number of clicks, you'll have a much happier experience. And I'm all for this because I authenticate multiple times a day with RSA, just trying to get to my work assets. So I'm pretty sure that across the consumer world, the faster that we can get to our end goal, the happier we will be. So again, here's the QR code to get all of the FIDO guidelines. The UX working group really appreciates you attending these webinars, and we're here to answer any questions that you have. Mitchell?
I think I'm coming back on now to bring us through Q&A. Is that right? Yeah, so as you can see there, that's where you can get the guidelines. And it's also do a quick search on the FIDO Alliance website or FIDO Alliance design guidelines. That'll bring you to the site as well. And they're freely available. We're seeing lots of downloads. And anecdotally, I can tell you, in speaking with people who've deployed Passkeys, one of the earlier adopters, and more recently as well, time after time, we hear that people find immense value in these guidelines. So they stand to save you meaningful time and money by using these best practices, which, as we've talked about today in previous webinars, are based on exhaustive research scoped by experts in the field. So thanks to the three of you for speaking so far. We're getting some Q&A now. I think that what you've heard so far today is really representative of what we do as an alliance and also as a broader community. So both Mitchell and Philip have been vital contributors inside the UX working group. Important to note, Matthias and Kayak are not members, but he's been incredibly generous with his time and sharing his learnings. I think everybody's motivated by our broader mission, which is reducing dependence on passwords. And Philip, you mentioned it towards the end of your comments before. I think we can all relate to this as consumers. Less passwords, please. So we're all motivated both professionally and personally to help hit this mission of more passkeys and less passwords. So let's open up for some questions. Here's one that came in. So once someone has started using passkeys, if there's still a password on the site, is it important to maintain password hygiene? Should they be changing their passwords on a regular basis, even once they've decided to implement a passkey? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I can jump in and just off the cuff, and I can share that when it comes to password hygiene, of course, it's good to, the traditional guidance is good to choose that good password. But really, I don't think there's a tremendous amount of provable benefit long term for regular changing of the password. So unless that password has been stolen or washed or something has happened or it's been reused. So I really think you can start to depend on that passkey and then sort of let the password fall by the wayside. And maybe one day do Kayak's brave move of deleting the password completely.
Super, thank you. I actually, on that point, Matthias, have you seen the downside, to deleting passwords when this was, you made that decision? What has there been any negative ramifications of taking that action?
I don't feel that way. So just to be more, let me share more specific examples how difficult the world got with passwords. I mean, it became a regular occurrence to have so-called credential stuffing attacks, which is the problem that somebody found 1 million usernames and passwords somewhere, and now they're just going everywhere in the web, and they try if these passwords get them into an account there too, which is a tremendous problem. It starts to go into the general system load. It is watching it. You always wonder, did they maybe find an account? And you're now resetting many accounts. But even on a smaller scale, so we are actively out there, like many companies, with a public bug bounty program where basically security researchers can submit security issues they see in our products. And we would more and more see people send us password dumps that they found all over the place in sort of the dark web, right? Like wherever they get them. And also there, like, like we didn't even want to validate them, right? At this point, you only reset these passwords, but it just seems to be such a tremendous effort. And yeah, at the same time, I haven't heard a single so let's put it this way. Initially, users who didn't get the hang yet that there are now passkeys, they were frustrated. Why do I have to get these email code all the time? The password was so much easier. It goes into my password manager. But once they understood that the password has just been replaced by the passkey, we haven't had any of such negative feedback at all anymore.
Okay, that's great to hear. I think it's interesting. Kayak is one of the earliest adopters of Passkeys. So your experience has been very illuminating. And one thing we've heard as we talk to companies that have been implementing more recently is that they're benefiting from the fact that there is more awareness out there for consumers. Our own data shows that over half of consumers are aware of what passkeys are and have registered one. And if you think about the size of the services that support passkeys, it's not entirely surprising. Right? You're talking about Kayak, but you're also talking about Google and PayPal and TikTok and Apple and Microsoft, and billions and billions of users, billions of accounts can support passkeys. So I think as there's more familiarity, there should be more comfort with using this and less reticence in getting rid of passwords. And people will probably appreciate being able to just use a passkey, not deal with SMS, OTP, and other forms of legacy 2FA. So some added questions coming in. So here's a good one. Is there published guidance for offering passkeys to users who have accounts, who aren't doing account recovery, but just trying to authenticate? All right, so what's the best way to engage with, I guess, happy users who already have accounts and get them to use passkeys?
So I can jump on this one if you want, Mitchell. So we institute a program with our customers called the Nudge program, and it's a full-on education program about the benefits of passkeys as they're going through the authentication process. So they may be using a method that we don't necessarily want them to use, or we want them to use a more secure method. So we use a nudge that informs them with a pop-up about what it is that's dismissible, but it's sort of like an inline promotion for having them move to a more secure methodology. And Mitchell, I think you do the same type of thing, right?
Yeah, and that's right. So what we do is, and there is guidelines specifically about this. I think a good example is SMS OTP in terms of the FIDO UX guidelines. In the FIDO UX guidelines, there is guidance in there as to helping a user transition to passkeys during authentication. And these are broad level guidelines that you can apply to almost any authentication method. It's just SMS OTP is so common that we chose to sort of double down on this. At Google, what we do is as a user is signing in, once they have authenticated and we're sure it's them based on the existing two-step verification or one-step verification standards, then we sort of ask them to create a passkey, and we share the benefits that we have found that resonate with the user when it comes to creating a passkey. And we found that to be very effective in terms of getting users to adopt and use passkeys.
That makes perfect sense. And so Mitchell, putting you on the spot a little bit, an inbound question. Can you talk a little bit about Google's plans for deleting passwords or allowing people to delete passwords? Is that on the roadmap? Is there anything you could share with today's audience?
So I can't speak to specific roadmaps or specific details, but what I can say is that in my opinion, an account can't be completely secure if there's a less secure authentication backdoor still on that account. And then to answer your question more directly, my opinion is that if an account has a passkey and the account still has a password, then that account can only really be as safe as the passkey can allow if we get rid of the password. And that is my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And we don't have that live yet, but just one thought I have for the future of Kayak's implementation. So I guess we can imagine that eventually people may lose passkeys. It sounds like more like a user error, or I don't know, but let's just assume some a few people will lose their passkeys. And so the question is, what's the recovery method? And I think this recovery method also has to be designed as secure as the passkey, which is going to be critical here. So basically, the user has to immediately, again, create a passkey on the way in, and it has been very secure. But yeah, I agree what Mitchell said, like the account is only as secure as the weakest authentication method you have on it.
Yeah, and not to promote other FIDO activities, but this is part of the work we're doing in identity verification. And we just launched our IDV face recognition certification program, which allows people to, well, it addresses the point that you're hitting on, the two of you are hitting on, that your account's really only authentication is a huge piece of things, but it's not the only piece. You need to look at the entire account lifecycle from account creation to recovery. And if you're allowing knowledge-based factors for account creation or for recovery, that's a glaring hole that attackers will leverage. So ultimately, I think I believe that everyone realizes that the end goal is to get to a place like where Kayak is, for example, like not relying on passwords at all and deleting the passwords altogether. But depending on a company's posture and background and customer base, it may take more time to get there. Good related question, something to ponder. What percentage of passkey users don't even know the site they connect to is using passkeys? So I'm going to take a slightly different tack on that question. We could answer that one. I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts on that, but also how many people are using passkeys but don't know they're using passkeys? So two adjacent questions. So the first one is how many passkey users are going to sites and don't know they have the option to use passkeys? And I think that's an interesting question, but also a lot of people might be using passkeys but not consciously aware of it, because the user flow really isn't that different than if you're on a mobile device and say your normal like Face ID or fingerprint flow. So I'd be curious to get your three thoughts on those two questions.
I can start with that one. So specifically, as I shared, we started to offer passkeys the moment when I believe iOS 16 came out. And so nobody really had heard about passkeys at that time, if you haven't been at WWDC pretty much, or working with the FIDO Alliance, of course. So we made it on purpose look as normal, not passkey as possible in a way. And this worked really well on the Apple devices because as Andrew was saying, like, it just looks like a Face ID biometric authentication with not much around it. And we like that because we don't want to give you, we didn't want to make it a technology discussion. We just wanted to make it easy for you to log in.
Interesting. Yeah. Anyone else?
I think to follow on, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mitchell.
Please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, to follow on what was just said, right? I think the interesting thing about people that don't know that they're using passkeys is because it looks like methods that they're already used to using for signing into their phone or opening their phone. And so this goes back to the whole usability thing, right? The ease of use. The more they think that things aren't different, the more they think they're the same. And so if we can introduce higher security by making it look and feel like what they used to do or what they're used to doing for other activities, then that's the win for us. So I would say that there's probably a large number of people that are just like, oh, use Face ID? Sure. They had no idea that it also added something to their phone or their device.
And huge agree, absolutely. I think that that is something that is really helpful with the pervasiveness of biometrics on modern devices and how easy they are to use, is that there's a trust that's built there and there's a familiarity, and when we can use that to authenticate security, that's really powerful. But I would be very certain that there is a large cohort of users who don't specifically know about the passkey technology, but they're authenticating with it. And I think a good example, I think Andrew touched on, is the familiarity. So if you're using a great credential manager, for example, the act of using that credential manager will feel, that credential manager with the username and password will feel a lot like using a passkey, because that credential manager will often gate authentication or access to that credential with the biometric and screen lock. And I think that's a really great thing. And I think that because I think that's a great thing because credential managers are very effective, they're very helpful, and also users use them for that usability convenience benefit, and we know that's very important to users. So I think it's further proves the benefit of passkeys with that similar experience.
Yeah, oftentimes when I'm asked by friends and family, so people not in the our immediate circle of authentication weirdos. How's this work? And the basic explanation is, what you do to unlock your device is what you do to sign in, and that's the beauty of integrated biometric is really a password manager. People don't know it's a password manager, but it is. It's a very intuitive user experience, and like you're saying, or Philip said quite eloquently, if people don't know they're using a passkey and it's the same thing they've always been doing, that is a win in a lot of ways. But I'd also, a counterpoint to that though, is that when we introduced this concept of passkeys, of the brand, if you will, the term passkeys, the iconography, and the efforts we're putting behind these patterns and these UX flows, part of the goal there is to create some consumer awareness around passkeys. Right. So before we all landed on this term passkeys and the common iconography, you could do a lot of this with WebAuthn. Now you couldn't sync the private key, of course, but FIDO, this is not new technology. Right? FIDO 2 has been around for a long time, and people were doing WebAuthn before, but there wasn't any common way of referring to this. And so we saw different companies who were early adopters of WebAuthn saying different things to different people. It might say, use your device unlock, use your fingerprint next time, or use WebAuthn. But the inconsistency, I think, actually really held us back as an industry in our broader mission, which is getting everyone talking about the same thing in the same way. And by introducing these flows and then really trying to encourage people to have common patterns, I think ultimately it creates a scenario where it'll be easier and easier for newer adopters to support passkeys with higher confidence and knowing that their users will be familiar, if not fully comfortable, and if not actually actively looking for passkeys for sign-in. So it's an interesting evolution that'll be good to keep on tracking. Okay, we have a little bit more time here. So a couple questions on security and biometrics. How are the private keys protected? How confident do we feel about using biometrics and for passkey sign-in in general? Does anyone want to kind of touch on security aspects of how passkeys are stored and protected?
I think I can speak to it a little bit, but again, sort of, I'm a product designer and UX expert, so I can speak to it in terms of like high-level terms. When the private key is stored in a secure part of the device and often as part of a credential manager, so it's stored and encrypted in that aspect and really can't be accessed by anybody apart from you using your biometric. The biometric is the handshake that gets you access to the correct signature generated by the private key, so you can do that handshake with the public key that's stored on the website like kayak.com. Was there another part of that question?
Biometrics, like this, I think talking about how biometrics stay in device, I think it's an important message to get across.
I think, and anybody else can feel free to jump in on any of these topics, but biometrics themselves, the attacks for biometrics need to be a lot more targeted and focused and often in person actually, than online attacks that use username, passwords, or SMS. So an SMS authentication system can be compromised remotely, via the SMS or phishing attacks that I shared earlier. Sort of device notifications can be compromised remotely, but passkeys can't, and biometrics would often need to be accessed in person. So I do see an example in the questions of fingerprints online or photographs online. And a lot of biometrics are resistant to a photograph being used to try and unlock like a face scan biometric. And thumbprints would have to be obtained in real life. And so that really scales down the level of attack that's available. So the attack vector is no longer anybody on the web who has a phone number and that phone number has a call center that can be called for support. It now becomes, okay, I have to go to you in person and I have to steal your fingerprints and then I have to use them effectively on your device. Because again, the biometrics don't leave the device. So if I did somehow get a copy of your fingerprint and I imprinted it on some silicone that could fool a sensor, I would then need to take your device and then use that on your fingerprint sensor. So it's very targeted. So again, it's not like the threat vector doesn't exist. The threat vector has been scaled down hugely.
Yeah, but I think ultimately the goal here is to prevent remote attacks and scalable remote attacks in particular. So Matthias before was talking about credential stuffing, and that still is a threat vector. But I'm firmly of the mindset that to take over someone's account, it should be that difficult. you should have to, do Mission Impossible type work to take over someone's account, not just sit behind a laptop halfway around the world and spray username and password combos to take over someone's account. And Passkeys explicitly prevent that and prevent credential phishing as well, of course.
Yeah, and to jump in here from our side, just to make this clear. So Passkeys is, as we say, it's private public key encryption, and us as Kayak, we only have the public key of the passkey. What does that mean? If you would tomorrow get a USB drive of all of our public keys, you still wouldn't be able to log in as these people, because the only piece to log in is the private key. And now the private key, certainly it's in your browser, it is on your device, it is protected by biometrics, by the device that you own. And there's certainly a lot of trust going into that software, your credential manager, your password manager, your biometrics. But from our perspective, there are much bigger forces there making this safe. So we can all, as a relying party, I'm basically thinking that over time, the camera in my phone is just going to get better and better, having more detailed 3D scans or whatever may happen to step up the biometrics. And this is nothing that we have to do ourselves, but this is something that the industry as a whole is going to do, and the big players.
Yep.
Yeah, and again, it's that possession aspect, right? Andrew, it's that possession aspect that is most critical here from a security perspective, right? So to Mitchell's point, if you don't have that device, if you're not physically present, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, it's possession-based authentication. It's some way I describe it that way sometimes, because that's what it is. I mean, you need to be in possession of the device, and so to attack it, you need to be in possession of the possession-based device, which is incredibly powerful. But it also helps. I mentioned prevents credential phishing attacks. It also is very strong against social engineering works, and it works extremely well. And social engineering is only going to get more and more sophisticated and daunting with the use of generative AI. Right, so you think about your best, quote unquote, best phishing email. Now imagine that message being delivered in with perfect grammar in every language on the planet to users, all over the world. That's what generative AI can do, and so it's really important to make sure that people, who will be fooled by these messages, and they will do, have tools to protect themselves from themselves. Additionally, social engineering, let's say network admins or help desk support, we're calling in for password resets, or on corporate settings, asking someone to reset a 2FA code. All those things are mitigated by passkeys as well, because it requires someone to be in possession of an authenticator. So whether you're using a sync passkey or a security key, whatever it might be, defaulting to possession of the device takes away so many of these remote threats. Matthias, a question for you specific to your implementation. Why does the Kayak passkey implementation require a username entry on login? So is that your flow? So you need to enter username first, and then you're prompted for passkey?
Yes, and let me answer that in two ways. So the first is, if when creating a passkey or a WebAuthn credential, there is a notion of a username. And this doesn't have to be an email address. And practically speaking, if you then put this passkey, let's say, into a credential manager, it will help you to understand, if you have 5 different passkeys, so to speak, it will help passkey 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You could think of that as a username. But now, practically speaking, for our implementation, it is a fundamental assumption in our system that every user has an email address. And since we are an e-commerce, it's called retailer and e-commerce site, we want to have a dialogue with our customers. So for instance, we want to motivate you to sign up for our newsletters. We want to send you a booking receipt and all these things. And so that's our fundamental requirement, that every account is tied to an email address. It's not a passkey requirement, and the username could just be a word that doesn't look like an email address or a number or whatever the implementation wants to do.
Super. Okay. So thanks so much. So look, everybody, we're at time here. So thanks everyone. So first of all, thanks again to our speakers for taking time today, but also all the work you do inside of FIDO Alliance Working Group and for the industry. So thank you all so much. Thanks to all of you who are attending. A couple actions for you. First of all, view the guidelines, download download them, or visit the site with all the design resources that you need. Secondly, we have the fourth webinar in our series next week on July 2nd. Please register for that as well. It's an AMA, so if you didn't get your questions answered today, and there are some outstanding, please bring them to our session next week. And then lastly, please take a few moments to fill out the survey as you exit. We really do want your feedback on today's webinar and our webinar program in general. So with that, thank you all so much. Hope you have a good day, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future FIDO Alliance webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right. We're off.